Here it is, the last 3 chapters of The Sign of the Beaver. Chapter 23. Matt filled his days with work. He made the cabin trim. Where the clay had dried and crumbled away between the logs, he brought new mud, strengthening it with pebbles, and packed the spaces tightly. On the inside, he chinked every tiny crack to make the room snug. The piles of logs stacked against the cabin wall grew steadily higher. His meager harvest was safely stored away. The corn, the little he had managed to save from the deer and crows, had all been shucked. Sitting by the fire after his supper, he scraped the dried kernels from the cobs, remembering the many long evenings at home when he and his sister Sarah had been set to do the same work, with a corn scraper. Sarah would laugh now to see him rubbing away with an old clamshell like an Indian. Some of the ears of corn he had hung against the wall by the twisted husks, as he had seen his mother do. She had said once that they were like scraps of sunshine in the dark days. Overhead, he hung strips of pumpkin on ropes of vine strung from wall to wall. They would be ready for his mother to make into pies. In the corner leaned an old flour sack, overflowing with the nuts he had gathered, hickory and butternut, and even the acorns he had once thought proper food only for squirrels. On the shelf ranged birch baskets filled with dried berries and the wild cranberries he had discovered shining like jewels along the boggy shores of the pond. They were puckery to the tongue, but when his mother came, she would bring sugar, and the stewed cranberries would make for a fine treat with her bread of white flour. Matt forced himself to eat sparingly of these things. The corn he regarded as a sort of trust. His father had planted it, and would be counting on it to feed the family through the winter. And some must be saved for the spring planting. Proud though he was of his harvest, Matt knew in his heart that it was far from enough. The hunt for food would be never-ending. Hour after hour with his bow, Matt tramped through the forest, the dog beside him. There was not much game to hunt these days. More often than not, his snares were empty. Soon the animals would be buried deep in burrows. Twice he had glimpsed a caribou moving through the trees, but he had little hope of bringing down any large animal with his light arrows. Once in a long while, he succeeded in shooting a duck or a muskrat. The squirrels were too quick for him. Although the dog was certainly not much of a hunter, he did occasionally track down some small creature. But he also had to eat his share, sometimes more than his share, because Matt couldn't resist those beseeching eyes. Truth to tell, they were both hungry much of the time. Luckily, they would not starve with the pond and the creeks teeming with fish. Matt knew that for many months of the year, fish filled the Indian crock pots, or cook pots. Luckily, too, they were easy to catch, though Matt had to be continually twisting and splicing new lines from the vines and spruce roots. Mornings now, he had to shatter a skim of ice on the pond. Soon he would have to cut holes with his axe and let his line down deep. He shivered just to think about it. It was the cold that bothered him the most. His homespun jacket was still sound, since he had little use of it in the warm weather. But his breeches were threadbare. One knee showed naked through a gaping hole, and the frayed legs stopped a good 5 inches above his ankles. His linen shirt was thin as a page of his father's Bible, and so small for him that it threatened to split every time he moved. Inside the cabin, he was scarcely warm enough. The moment he ventured outside, his teeth chattered. He thought enviously of the Indian's deerskin leggings, but a deer was far beyond his prowess as a hunter. There were 2 blankets on his pine bed, his father's and his own. Why couldn't one of them cover him in the daytime as well as in the night? He spread a blanket out on the floor and hacked it with his axe and his knife, using his worn-out breeches as a pattern. From the leftover scraps, he carefully pulled threads and twisted them together. He had seen the Indian women use in bone needles, and he searched about outside the cabin till he found some thin, hard bits of bone. These he shaved down with his knife. He ruined 3 bits trying to poke a hole through the bone before he thought to try a thin slit instead of to hold the thread. Finally, he managed to sew his wool in pieces together. He thrust his legs into the shapeless breeches and gathered the top about his waist with a bit of rope. He was mighty pleased with himself. He was forever going to be hauling them up, and they were sure to trip him if he had to run, but at least he could kneel on the ice and pull in his lines. From 2 rabbit skins he made some mittens without thumbs. He had no stockings, and his moose-hide moccasins were wearing thin. He decided that he could stuff them with scraps of blanket, or even with duck feathers. Then he remembered once in a downpour, Etienne had shown him how to line his moccasins with dried moss to soak up the rain. Perhaps moss could soak up the cold as well, and there was plenty of it about. His most satisfying achievement, though, was his fur hat. For this, he knew he must have more fur. In the woods, Etienne had once pointed out to him a deadfall, constructed of heavy logs so intricately balanced that they would fall with deadly accuracy on an animal that attempted to steal the bait inside. Beaver and otter were caught in such traps. Etienne explained sometimes even a bear. Now Matt determined to make one for himself, perhaps a small one. It would take a very large log even to stun a strong animal, and he had no wish to come upon a bear, much less a wounded bear. Much as he would like a bear skin, he would try for a smaller animal. He felled and trimmed 2 good-sized trees. Setting the logs on lighter posts was a feat of delicate balance that took him hours of patient trial and error. Over and over they crashed down, threatening his toes and fingers. Finally, they held to his satisfaction, and gingerly he slipped 3 fish inside the trap. To his astonishment, on the 3rd morning he found an animal lying under the fallen logs, so nearly dead that it was no task to club it. It was smaller than the otters he had seen playing on the banks. A fisher, perhaps? That night he and the dog feasted on crackling bits of roasted meat. It was strong flavored, and he knew the Indians did not care to eat it, but he could not be so choosy. Other strips he hung over the fire to smoke. There was also a scant amount of yellow fat. Used sparingly, a spoonful of the fat would make his usual fish diet taste like a banquet. The real treasure was the pelt, heavy and lustrous. He worked on it slowly as he watched the Indian women work. With a sharp-edged stone, he scraped away every trace of fat and flesh from the skin, washed it in the creek, and for days in his spare hours rubbed and stretched it to make it soft and pliable. Then he set to work with his bone needle. He was enormously proud of the hat he fashioned. Saknus himself would envy it. Most of the work he'd done by firelight. He longed for candles. He ate his supper by the light of a split pine branch set in the crack of the chimney. They gave light aplenty, but they smoked and dripped a sticky pitch, and he was always afraid he might drop off to sleep and wake up to find the log chimney afire. At any rate, after a day of chopping and tramping, he was tired enough to go to bed with the dark. So often as he did the squaw work that Etienne would have despised, thoughts of his mother filled his head. He imagined her moving about the cabin, humming her little tunes as she beat the batch of cornbread, shaking out the board cloth at the door, for of course she would not let them eat on a bare table. He could see her sitting by the firelight in the evening, her knitting needles clacking as she made a woolen sock for him. Sometimes he could almost hear the sound of her voice, and when he shut his eyes, he could see her special smile. He tried to think of ways to please her. She would need new dishes for the good meals she would cook, and he whittled out 4 wooden trenchers and 4 clean new bowls, rubbing them smooth with sand from the creek. He made a little brush to clean them with from the birch sapling, carefully splitting the ends into thin fibers. In the same way, he made a sturdy birch broom to sweep the floor. Then he set himself with a more difficult task, a cradle for the baby. With only an axe and his knife, the work took all his patience. His first attempts were only fit for kindling, but when the cradle was done, he was proud of it. It was clumsy, perhaps, but it rocked without bumping, and there wasn't a splinter anywhere to harm the baby's skin. Sitting by the fire, it seemed to promise that soon his family would be there. When he had a few more rabbit skins, he would make a soft coverlet. For Sarah, he made a cornhusk doll with corn silk hair. He was surprised at how much he looked forward to Sarah's coming. Back home she had been nothing but a pesky child, always following him about and pestering him to be taken along wherever he was going. Now he remembered the way she'd run to meet him when he came home from school, pigtails flying, eyes shining, demanding to know everything that was happening there. Sarah hated fiercely being a girl and having no school to go to. She would be full of curiosity in the forest. She wasn't afraid like most girls. She was spunky enough to try anything. She was like the Indian girl, Etienne's sister. What a pity they couldn't have known each other. Chapter 24. Matt stood looking up at the sky over the clearing. "It's gonna snow," he told the dog. "You can feel it, can't you?" The dog lifted its nose, testing the promise in the air. Matt reckoned he had been lucky so far. The heavy snows had not come. There had been flurries, thin and swirling, sifting through the trees. Many mornings he had to walk to find a coating of white on the he had woken to find a coating of white on the cabin roof, which would melt away under the noonday sun. Today, everything seemed different. The sky was the color of his mother's pewter plate. The brown withered leaves on the oak trees hung motionless from the branches. 3 crows searched noisily among the dried corn stalks. A flock of small birds hopped nervously under the pines. "It's almost Christmas," he said out loud. He could not remember for sure how many weeks belonged to each month. Somehow he was not even certain that he'd remember to cut a notch every day. Each day was so like the day before. And Christmas Day, when it came, would not have anything to mark it at all from all the others. He tried to put it out of his mind, the thought of his mother's Christmas pudding. "We better get an extra firewood," he said, and the dog scrambled eagerly after him. Late in the day, the snow began, soundlessly, steadily. Before dark, it had laid a white blanket over the trees and the stumps in the cabin. When Matt and the dog went outside at bedtime, the chilly whiteness reached over his moccasins and closed around his bare ankles. They were both thankful to hurry inside again. The next morning, in the darkness of the cabin, Matt made his way to the door. He could scarcely push it open. The bank of snow outside reached almost to the latch. He stared at it in alarm. Was he going to be prisoner in his own cabin? With all his preparations, he never thought about a shovel. His axe would be about as much use as a teaspoon. He set himself to hewing a slab of firewood to make some sort of blade. By the time he had dug a few feet of pathway, the sun was high. He stepped into the dazzling white world. Now, at last, he could make use of the snowshoes that hung on the cabin wall. Eagerly, he strapped the bindings about his legs and climbed up out of the narrow path he had dug. The snowshoes held him lightly. He stood poised on the snow like a duck on the water. But with his first few steps, he discovered that he could not even waddle like a duck on land. The clumsy hoops got in each other's way, one of them forever getting trapped beneath the other one. All at once he got the knack of it, and he wanted to shout out loud. He tramped from one of his snares to another, waiting every few minutes for the dog who floundered happily behind him. The snares were buried deep and empty, and he set them higher in case some animal might venture out of its burrow. Then he tramped all the way to the pond for the sheer pleasure of it. Coming back through the woods, he marveled at his own tracks, like the claw prints of a giant bird. Suddenly, he realized that he was happy, as he had never been in the weeks since Etienne had gone away. He was no longer afraid of the winter ahead. The snowshoes had set him free. The cabin was warm and welcoming. He melted snow in his kettle and made tea of tips of hemlock. He shelled and crushed a handful of acorns and boiled them with a strip of pumpkin. Afterwards, for the first time in weeks, he took down Robinson Crusoe, reading by the firelight. He felt drowsy and contented. Life on a warm island in the Pacific might be easier, but tonight Matt thought that he wouldn't have for a moment have given up his snug cabin buried in the snow. Chapter 25. 3 days later, snow threatened again, and Matt gathered a pile of firewood to dry inside. He had just carried in his third armful load when he heard the dog barking frantically a short distance away. Matt found him standing on the bank of a creek, his feet braced, the ridge of hair standing up along his back. Peering along the creek, Matt caught his breath. Something dark was moving along the frozen course of the stream. A huge shape, too large to be an animal, even a moose. Then he saw it was a man, dragging behind him some sort of sled. He didn't move like an Indian. As he watched, Matt made out a second smaller shape, just coming into sight around the bend of the creek. He didn't dare to shout for fear that they would vanish like ghosts. He stood still, his heart pounding. Then he finally began to run. "Pa!" he choked. "Pa!" His father flung down the pack he carried. His arms went around Matt and held fast, though he could not manage to speak a word. Then Matt saw his mother struggle to climb down from the sled. He bent and threw his arms around her. How small she seemed, even under the heavy cloak. Sarah came floundering through the snow in her father's footsteps and stood staring at him, her eyes bright under her woolen hood. She wasn't the child he remembered. Awkwardly, he put his arms around her and gave her a big hug. Then they were all talking at once, trying to be heard over the fierce clamor of the dog. "Quiet," Matt shouted at him. "This is my family. They've come. They're actually here." They pushed their way through the snow to the cabin, leaving the sled where it stood in the middle of the ice. Matt helped his mother over the doorstep. He could see she was scarcely able to stand, and he pulled a stool nearer to the fire for her. She clung to him, her eyes on his face. Matt would hardly have recognized her, so thin and pale, with great shadows under her eyes. But those eyes were warm and shining, and her smile was as beautiful as he remembered. "I was bound we'd get here for Christmas," she panted. "I couldn't have borne it to let Christmas go by. Oh, Matt, you're safe." "It was the typhus," his father explained. "We all took sick with it, and the fever was bad. Takes all the strength out of your body. Your ma got the worst of it. We ought to have waited longer till she was more fit, but she was dead set on starting. The river's most frozen shut. We had to wait at the trading post 3 weeks before anyone would risk carrying us. Then we had to get the sled made. But your ma, she just kept pushing us. She's a rare one, your ma." "I had to," she said. "Thinking of you alone in this place." "It wasn't so bad," Matt said stoutly. "I wasn't alone. All the time I had the Indians." "Indians?" his mother gasped. "Are there Indians hereabouts?" "Pa said there wouldn't be," Sarah exclaimed, wide-eyed. "What are they like?" "They're gone now," Matt said, "but they were my friends." And then he brought it out proudly. "I had an Indian brother." From the way they stared at him, he could see it was going to take a mighty lot of explaining before they could understand. He didn't suppose they ever would, truly. His father said nothing. He was looking soberly at the snowshoes propped against the wall, and at the bow hanging over the door where the rifle should have been. Everywhere he looked, Matt realized, he must have seen something the Indians had given him, or taught him how to make for himself. However, his father seemed to think there was no time for questions. "We better unpack the sled," he said, "before it starts to snow again." Matt sprang to help. There was one question he dared not ask till he and his father alone. "The baby, did you leave it behind?" His father ran a hand over his beard. His eyes were troubled. "The little one only lived 5 days," he answered. "'Twas a pitiful little thing that would never have made the journey. Just don't say aught to your ma. She still takes it hard." Matt promised. Oh, he wished he had somehow been able to hide the cradle before she noticed it. Standing in the snow, his father reached down and put a hand on Matt's shoulder. "You done a grown man's job, son," he said. "I'm right proud of you." Matt could not speak. It took his breath away to think that he might have gone with the Indians, and that they might have come to an empty cabin and found all his mother's fears had come true. He would never have heard the words his father had just spoken. This was how Atienne had felt, he knew, when he had found his Manitou and become a hunter. As his father untied the bundles from the sledge, Matt lugged them into the cabin. Flour, molasses, a fine new kettle, warm bright quilts, and thanks be, new boots for him and a woolen jacket and breeches. He felt richer than Robinson Crusoe with all the plunder from the sinking ship. Then he noted that his father had a new rifle, and presently he discovered, poking out from his mother's pack, his own old musket. He hadn't a doubt she'd learned to use it, and would have, too, had her family been threatened. He suspected that even Sarah, so grown up now, wouldn't have feared to pull the trigger if there had been need of it. Well, there'd be no more need of it now, with 2 men to fend for them. Inside the cabin, Sarah was bustling capably about, unwrapping the pewter dishes, setting out the little whale oil lamp that had always stood on the table in Quincy. "That's the funniest looking dog I ever saw," she said. "It won't come near us." "He's an Indian dog," Matt told her. "He's suspicious of white folks. You wait. You'll get to like him. He couldn't get over how much older she looked, but still spunky. Her eyes were sparkling, and Matt suspected that for her long journey had just been an adventure. He should have made her a bow instead of a doll, and he would too the first chance he got. His mother had thrown off her cloak. And the fire had brought a little bit of color to her cheeks. She was making a great show of coming home. If the cabin seemed rough and cramped after the pretty house she had left behind, she never let on for a moment. She went on about admiring everything, the dried ears of corn, the strings of pumpkin, and the fine new wooden bowls he had carved. All this food, she marveled, and I feared you were starving. He was thankful now for the times he'd gone hungry to save what he could for their coming. There's jerky for supper, he told her. I tried not to eat too much of it. You can make a pretty fair stew with that and a little bit of pumpkin. Some salt would sure help if you brought any. As he stared out again, his mother stopped him and put her hands on his shoulders. Wait a minute, she said. I just want to look at you. She had to tip her head back to do it. You look different, Matt. You're almost tall as your pa. And awful thin. You're so brown I'd have taken you for an Indian. I almost was one, he said, giving her a quick hug to show he was joking. He hoped that she'd never know how true it was. We're going to have neighbors, she said happily, as she set the new kettle over the fire. A man and his wife have a claim not 5 miles from here. They're staying at the trading post till spring. We plan to share a pair of oxen. They say 3 other families are coming too. They're going to set up a mill. Before you know it, we'll have a town here, maybe even a school for you children. Neighbors? That was a thought that would take some getting used to. Matt supposed he ought to be pleased. Yes, of course he was pleased. It was just that he rather liked it the way it was here in the forest, with all the gladness in him right now. He wouldn't have thought there'd be room for any other thought. But even now, with his family here, their voices filling the long silence, with all his worries vanishing like smoke up the chimney, he suddenly thought of the Indians. He wished that Etienne and his grandfather could know that he had been right to stay, that his father had come as he had promised them. But the old man had been right too. More white men were coming. There would be a town here on the land where the Indians had hunted the caribou and the beaver. If only he could be sure that the Indians had found a new hunting ground. Matt thrust his arms into the new jacket and went out again into the snow. Behind him the cabin glowed, warm and filled with life. Already steam was rising from the new kettle. He'd cook one of his special stews for them for supper, and he wouldn't have to eat it alone. They would all sit together around the table and bow their heads while his father asked for the blessing. Then he would tell them about Etienne. And that's the end.